I'm Corgi Mom, and you're watching Appleseed Academy. The first strike of the match ended with the regulars beginning their march to Concord after the battle on the Lexington Green. British Commander Colonel Smith ordered his men back into formation and onto the road to Concord. Of course, we know they were not the only men headed to Concord that morning. Militia were streaming in towards Concord from all across the countryside, responding to the alarms which began with Paul Revere and William Dawes. You'll recall, after Revere and Dawes warned Lexington and left for Concord, they encountered Dr. Samuel Prescott, who joined the pair. Prescott had been visiting his fiancée that evening. Their journey was made more difficult by the patrols deployed by General Gage. Dr. Prescott was the only alarm rider to reach Concord that night. And when he got to Concord, Prescott woke his brother Abel to alert others. Samuel Prescott went to the home of Isaac Davis, captain of the Acton Minutemen. Davis's Minutemen were the best equipped and best trained of all the militias in the area. Captain Isaac Davis was a gunsmith and a farmer, and one could argue that Isaac Davis didn't have to respond to the alarm that day. When Samuel Prescott arrived at his house, he found both Isaac and his wife Hannah awake, caring for all 4 of their children, ages 10, 7, 5, and 15 months. The children were sick with the canker rash, which we know today as scarlet fever. And with this illness, the children had a 50% chance of dying. And there were only 2 treatments at the time: a cold, wet cloth to the forehead and prayer. And this is exactly what Isaac and Hannah had been doing all night. But I imagine it did not surprise Hannah that her husband did not hesitate to answer the alarm. Hannah had probably watched her husband hammer and shape bayonets for his Minutemen, as he was determined that his company be as well equipped as the regulars. She had probably also seen Isaac fashion cartridge boxes for each man, so they might fire as quickly as any of the king's men. And surely she had heard their twice-weekly practices on the makeshift targets her husband set out behind their home. Hannah knew her husband emphasized marksmanship with his men, and she knew these high standards in terms of equipment and training made the Acton Company one of the best prepared in Massachusetts. As some of these men gathered at the Davis home that night, they helped themselves to some of Hannah's flour to put in their hair so it looked more like powdered wigs. They wanted to look their best going up against the king's men. Some of them even made jokes about finally getting a hit at old Gage. But Isaac Davis rebuked them, reminding them that the day had brought a most eventful crisis for the colonies. Blood would be spilt, that was certain. The Crimson Fountain would be opened. None could tell when it would close, nor with whose blood it would overflow. Let every man gird himself for battle, and be not afraid, for God is on our side. And before Isaac Davis stepped out into the night, he hesitated on the threshold and then turned back to his wife, forcing the words, "Take good care of the children." And he disappeared into the darkness. In her diary, Hannah Davis wrote that she believed it would be the last time she would ever see him again on this earth. And as the men of Acton marched to Concord, Davis was heard to say, "I have a right to go to Concord on the King's Highway, and I will go to Concord." After Concord had been alerted, the town sent Reuben Brown to Lexington, hoping he could gather more helpful details. Brown arrived in Lexington just before the regulars. But as soon as he heard gunfire, he immediately returned to Concord. In Concord, he was asked if the regulars were firing blanks or ball. He replied that he didn't know, but he thought it was ball. The Colonials began mustering with great haste from numerous towns all over the countryside. Abel Parker received the word while plowing his fields. He left the plow in the field with the oxen still hitched to it, ran to his house, grabbed his coat in one hand and the gun in the other, and then ran until he overtook his comrades, a distance of about 6 miles. The Concord militia gathered together at Wright's Tavern to decide what to do. The youngest in this group were the Minutemen, the ones trained to be ready to go in literally minutes. And at that moment, these Minutemen didn't understand why others were just standing around. They were anxious to head out and go find the Redcoats. But the men with families, the regular militia, were not so anxious to leave town. They proposed to stay to defend their homes and town. And then there were the older men with experience fighting Indians during the French and Indian War. They believed the right thing to do was to go to their training ground on Punkatasset Hill, overlooking the town. From there, they could see the town and allow their numbers to increase a bit, hopefully even the odds. They believed the town was no place to fight a battle, especially as they were outnumbered. So, as was customary in New England, where everyone has a say, they end up doing all 3 things. The young Minutemen left for Lexington to look for the Redcoats and to fight. The regular militia stayed in town to defend it. And the wise older men, you guessed it, headed for Punkatasset Hill. Well, those Minutemen came upon Colonel Smith and his column all too quickly. And at the sight of a sea of redcoats and glimmering bayonets a quarter-mile deep, they made an about-face and marched back to Concord, careful to remain just out of musket range from Smith's column. But as they arrived back in town, they discovered the regular militia had already heeded the advice of the older men and headed for Punkatasset Hill. So they just kept marching right through town to join them. Once Smith arrived in Concord, he divided his men into 3 groups. First, he orders his burly grenadiers to begin searching the town. Second, he sends out a detachment of his light infantry to the North Bridge. And third, he dispatched some soldiers to search Barrett's farm, which was beyond the North Bridge. And at Barrett's farm, the detachment came up empty-handed, not finding any military supplies. But before returning to Concord, they forced Mrs. Barrett to make breakfast for them. She refused the money they offered, calling it blood money. As the regulars left the farm, they noted a few boys plowing a field in the distance. Well, it was spring and time for planting, so there was nothing unusual about that. In fact, the boys waved at the soldiers, so the redcoats waved back. What the soldiers didn't see were muskets lying on the ground along that field, and one boy kicking a musket into the freshly plowed earth, and another boy kicking the dirt on top of that musket. The muskets the regulars were searching for were being planted on that farm as seeds of liberty. Meanwhile, back in town, Major Pitcairn and the regulars searched the village systematically for hidden material. Indeed, an enormous quantity of military equipment, such as 10 tons of musket balls, hundreds of barrels of food, and extensive quantities of other munitions, were stored in houses. In fact, the townsmen were exhausted from spending the previous day trying to hide it all. The regulars declined to search homes, however, because the owners denied having any supplies. A tavern owner named Ephraim Jones refused to allow the regulars into his establishment. Pitcairn ordered the doors broken down as they were looking for weapons. Jones denied having any supplies. Major Pitcairn knocked Jones to the ground and put a pistol to the tavern owner's head. Jones' memory got a lot better after that. "Oh, those cannon, they're in the back garden." The soldiers went out back, dug up the cannon, and damaged them to ensure they were unusable. Then Major Pitcairn bought breakfast for his men and insisted on paying Jones for it. They also found a store of lead bullets, which they threw in a pond. The townspeople recovered them the next day. After the search, any items considered of potential use to the rebels were piled up and set on fire. It's been said that the Redcoats chopped down the Concord Liberty Pole, which was a meeting place as well as a symbol of freedom to the colonists. By cutting down their Liberty Pole, it's as if the regulars were saying, "You don't have freedom. We decide if you have freedom or liberty." Well, sparks from this fire ignited the nearby meeting house. The regulars and colonists worked together, forming a bucket brigade to put the fire out. Up on Punkatasset Hill, Colonel Barrett's men saw the smoke rising. A junior officer, Lieutenant Hosmer, asked, "Will you let them burn the town down?" Colonel Barrett looked at the colonist who had joined him. Reality was setting in. It wasn't just fired up talk in a tavern anymore. The Redcoats were in Concord. Their town was burning. Captain Isaac Davis, who had left his wife and sick children, drew his sword and said, "I haven't a man who is afraid to go." Colonel Barrett ordered his men to load their weapons, but not to fire unless the regulars fired first. This was the same order that Captain Parker had issued at Lexington. It was part of a uniform colonist response that had been orchestrated by Paul Revere earlier. Colonel Barrett placed Isaac Davis's men in the lead since they were the best prepared and equipped unit there, then ordered the column forward, telling them that if the British did fire first, that they should return the fire as fast as they could. This column was led by Isaac Davis and the Acton Fifer, young Luther Blanchard. Now, imagine this approaching scene from the North Bridge, where regulars were on guard, anticipating merely farmers and shopkeepers. But rather than seeing hoes and hayforks, they saw companies of organized men, seemingly well-trained, carrying muskets and cartridge boxes. These regulars began pulling up the planks of the bridge as they positioned themselves at the far side, and their officer ordered them to fire one volley into the creek to demonstrate that they were firing ball, not blanks. But the militia didn't stop. They continued marching. Finally, the regulars fired one volley at the approaching militia. At this point, we should pause just for a moment and discuss the regulars' lack of marksmanship skill. Their musket, the Brown Bess, was a .75 caliber bore, but used a .71 caliber ball. This made reloading faster, but since the ball bounced around in the bore, the accuracy was not good. They had difficulty hitting a man at a distance of 50 yards. To fire at a target at 200 yards, one might as well have been firing at the moon. The typical regular was not taught precision marksmanship. The word aim was not even in their list of commands. After the command present, the regulars were commanded to fire. The only ones who practiced precision marksmanship were their flankers, pickets, and rangers. Indeed, the militia ridiculed the regulars' marksmanship skills, saying they fired by guess. The Colonial Army, of course, heavily stressed marksmanship proficiency. Indeed, they made a significant innovation when they replaced the command present with the command take sight. Now we return to the story. The militia approaching the North Bridge was 400 strong compared to the 100 Redcoats. The Redcoats were led by Captain Walter Laurie, who failed to control his men. Instead of employing a well-known maneuver which could have stopped the militia, He and his men became chaotic and confused. They retreated over the bridge and began firing without orders. Most of their rounds went over the heads of the militia, as might be expected. However, Isaac Davis was killed instantly by a bullet through his heart. Those near him said the blood gushed from his chest and splattered all over them. Abner Hosmer was killed by a shot to the head. The young fifer, Luther Blanchard, received 2 wounds. He died a few months later, most probably from those wounds. Timothy Brown exclaimed that the redcoats were firing ball. Major Buttrick gave the order, "Fire! Fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire! Fire as fast as you can!" The militia concentrated their fire on the British officers, hitting half of them with the first volley before firing a second. Just imagine the reaction of the regulars to those 2 volleys. The regulars were accustomed to exchanging several volleys before actually advancing and winning the battle with their 18-inch long bayonets. Volleys were really just to break up the column. But suddenly, all around them, men were dying, including those in command. They had never experienced this before, so they fled, some even dropping their muskets. This particularly surprised Major Pitcairn, who had said earlier that he could simply draw his sword and the entire militia would turn and run. Major Buttrick and his men did not pursue the retreating regulars, but split into 2 groups, one on each side of the river, behind a stone wall, expecting a counterattack, which never came, and knowing a detachment at Barrett's Farm would return their way. When the detachment of regulars who had been to Barrett's Farm returned, they immediately knew something was terribly wrong when they found dead and wounded fellow soldiers and saw militia guarding the bridge they now needed to cross. It was actually a miracle that their officer decided to cross that bridge and simply walk past the militia without engaging them. Remember, the militia had been ordered, "Do not fire unless fired upon." Those regulars guarding the bridge had fired first and only then had the militia fired. But these redcoats, returning from Barrett's Farm, did not fire. And so Major Buttrick allowed them to simply pass. Medical science at this time was essentially in a state of infancy. A wound, which would be of no consequence today, could result in a lengthy, lingering, painful death. Dr. Abel Prescott, Dr. Samuel Prescott's brother, was wounded at Concord and died the following August. One poor patriot was wounded in the foot, had it amputated, and gangrene set in. He went through several more amputations on his leg with the same result, eventually dying. Can you imagine having to suffer through all these amputations at this time in the history of medicine? These patriots knew of this danger, and this knowledge amplifies their bravery and heroism. Furthermore, if the wounds didn't kill you, the doctors were likely to. The accepted treatment for many sicknesses and wounds was bleeding. The colonists who stepped out of their homes to defend their liberty knew these risks and accepted them. For the first time, colonists had been ordered to fire upon British troops. And for the first time, colonists killed the king's soldiers. Again, the match of the Revolution had been struck. Again, there was a bright flash, a little smoke, and then nothing as the match went out. Here ends the second strike of the match, but I'd like to share some thoughts. Think about those farmers, shopkeepers, ministers, lawyers. When suddenly under fire, they did exactly what they were trained to do: fire accurately and aim for officers to make their hits most effective. Does it fill your heart with pride to know what these men did in those 2 minutes? That they set a standard for the rest of us? And what about Hannah Davis? As a wife and mother, I can't help but think about her sacrifice for my liberty. And through her diary, it's as if Isaac Davis is in fact speaking to every one of us. Are we taking good care of the children? Are we doing everything we can to ensure their liberty? Hannah wrote, "I knew in my heart that I would not see him again in this world." She was partly mistaken on that point, for she saw him hours later, laid out beside 2 other Minutemen on her parlor table, a grim reunion, to be sure. Let it not escape us, however, that the highway over which the body of Isaac Davis was carried home was the King's highway no longer. Hannah Davis knew what was going to happen, yet she let her husband go. To lose a husband in New England in 1775, with a house full of sick children, would have been a hardship of desperate measure, and still, she let him go. Hannah Davis placed a high price on liberty. On April 19, 1775, she paid in full. So let us remember, our liberty was won by the sacrifices of these patriots, and it cost them dearly. We should be clinging to the precious liberty those patriots paid for in blood. That liberty is our birthright and our responsibility. Thank you for listening today.